Chris for joining us. This is the last day of the FLVS 2020, and I'm very glad to have you here. We're going to be talking about the cognitive science, the cognition, and the laws, and whatnot. And just to briefly introduce everybody to Chris, he's a co-founder of Legra, if I'm not mistaken. He's also a koala, which does not stand for an animal, but rather a coalition of automated legal applications. And we met through the blockchain community, although you're no longer that much invested into the blockchain, but rather into the, okay, you'll tell us more about that, okay.
We're going to talk about it.
All right, so the floor is all yours. As far as I understand, you don't really have a presentation, but we'll rather just be talking about it. Perfect, we definitely love that. So go ahead, thank you for being with us.
Thank you, it's a real pleasure to participate. So the context for this talk is legal design, and any kind of social or economic collaboration, whether that's organizational governance or community governance or markets more or less regulated, and as you say, a nice blockchain example of that would be DAOs, distributed autonomous organizations, and a classical frame by which we can approach this kind of organizational governance or design is the classic frame from Ronald Coase of the firm and the market. So his paper from the 1930s, asking the question, why do firms exist at all? Why do organizations exist at all? If markets find the best prices to match supply and demand of goods and services, why do companies exist? Why do organizations exist? And Coase's answer was of course transaction costs. That in the market, searching and negotiating and contracting and potentially resolving disputes all add costs to collaboration and coordination. Whereas inside an organization, the coordination is instead by its administrative structure, its management. And so it's that avoiding the transaction costs that makes organizations economically efficient. And of course, there's a problem that comes from this kind of conventional organizational structure, which is that the internal administration is often feudalistic, top-down command and control. It potentially stifles innovation, and therefore so much of the sort of innovative direction in organization design in recent decades really has been in the direction away from the firm, away from the organization, more towards the market. And you can see this whether it's competing teams within an organization, like in Facebook, or so a kind of a market for outcomes within an organization, or at its most radical, if you look at something like Hire Group, turning their organization into a market, into a platform, lots of small semi-independent teams running different products. And again, DAOs are, I think, a prime example here. There's much more concern for market-like token holder proposals and voting, much less concern for firm-like executive structure or administrative structure. So I'd like to sort of introduce my critique of this trend here with a cognitive science perspective and a systems theoretic perspective. So there's a key concept that I'm going to rely on here from systems theory, which is to say that when you've got an interaction between, or a collaboration between different parts or participants in any kind of system, those interactions can be of two different kinds. They can be physical, they can be exchanges of energy or matter. And that's more what we might see if we're looking at systems ecology, say, or they can be informational. It's transactions involving representations, and that's especially relevant when we're considering organizations and markets. It's information processing, and for any representation, there's a trade-off. There's always a trade-off between grain and extent. That's how you describe it in ecology. between fine-grainedness or detail on the one hand, and on the other hand, the scope, the extent. And that could be spatial, it could be temporal, it could be in some other dimension. Imagine, in a simple example, imagine an image file. You know, the higher the resolution, the greater the detail with which you're capturing a given scene. For a given maximum file size, the smaller the spatial scope of that image. If you want more detail, you'll have to have a smaller image within a given, maximum file size. And the point here is that there is always a maximum file size. There is always a limit on the size of the representation that can be processed. If it's a human participant, we have cognitive limits. There's a limit to, if we're thinking of something, how much detail, how many different moving parts we can keep in mind at once while making sense of it. And so as a result of this necessary trade-off, for any more complex system, you get a number of different decisions on those trade-offs. So there will be information processing, there will be decisions that need to be made, which involve something with much longer time span or something over greater geographical scope. And because of cognitive limitations, those decisions will have to be made involving less detail. There will also be decisions where the detail really matters, but in order to zoom in and to make a decision on that level of detail, the scope will have to narrow. And because of these natural sort of different trade-offs, what you get is a natural systemic hierarchy. This was addressed in the 70s by a management theorist called Eliot. He had his time span of control theory, where he was studying organizations and noting that as people became more senior, the temporal scope of their decisions tended to increase. So the frequency with which they would be reviewing their decisions, or the time scale over which their decisions had an impact, would get larger higher up the organization. And if he'd taken the next step and introduced that kind of systems theoretic concern for the trade-off between scope and detail, he would have had to acknowledge that that means the level of detail gets less as one moves up the organization. So this is just a kind of quick introduction to defend the inherently hierarchical, in the systems theoretic sense, hierarchical nature of organizations. And it's something which is much harder to establish in a market context. And so I think this gives a countercultural view on the advantages of moving more in a market direction, and actually more of a more cautious perspective, which is to say that wherever the problems that we're trying to solve through collaboration or coordination, wherever they are simple enough that they can be reduced to a kind of a low dimensional representation, that the values that matter to us can all be expressed and represented, say, just in a currency, just in money. The value of everything can be reduced to a monetary value. Or maybe you have some, you have some DAO, and maybe there's more than one, but there's still a few. There's a small number of dimensions of value, and because of that relatively simple way of representing what matters, you can achieve coordination through market forces. But there's a whole other class of problems, and I would argue actually, many of the really important problems in the world, where that's not the case, where you can't reduce what matters to such a low dimensional representation. you are necessarily in a more complex system where there will necessarily be more of a systemic hierarchy of information processing that is required. And in that kind of a context, moving more towards a market-like design, whether it, legal design, regulatory design, design of governance systems, is actually denying you that kind of necessary depth, necessary systemic depth. You're forcing yourself to fit the problems into a low-dimensional representation. And so my sort of aim really with this talk is to try to bring fresh attention to what change might be possible more in a firm-like direction, more in an organization-like direction, without us having to stay stuck in the kind of feudalistic command and control paradigm of the sort of the 20th century corporation. And so I'll kind of finish really with just an illustration of what I think is possible there, and how might we, rethink or rehabilitate the firm, the organization, and explore the possibilities for new kinds of organizational design, or new kinds of governance. And that will be to introduce the idea of the intentional graph within an organization. So I've already said that there will be, we will naturally expect, because of the trade-off between the fine-grainedness of information processing and the scope of information processing, we will have this natural, a natural systemic hierarchy. And what I propose is that there are two key kinds of relationship between participants in such a systemically hierarchical system. One kind of relationship is where someone relies on someone else, and it could conventionally be a manager relying on one of their employees, one of their direct reports, but it doesn't have to be. It could equally be that I've volunteered to do something that I'm looking for someone who believes that this contribution I want to make is a contribution worth making. And if I can find that person, then we can have that shared understanding about what it is I'm trying to do, and the fact that I'm responsible for it, and they're relying on me for it. So it's inherently intersubjective. It's about us having this shared understanding of the intention, and I would argue that this is, in general, not going to be reducible to an objective representation that could be understood by anyone. So if your problems are simple and everyone has a shared context and everyone will interpret the words in the same way, then you can take a kind of project management approach to it. Just write a JIRA ticket, write out the intention. That's it, that paragraph. Everyone will interpret that paragraph the same way. Everyone has the same context. Everyone has the same knowledge. It's fine. You can just impersonally assign it to someone. But in the general case, having shared context with someone is much harder to achieve. And there are all sorts of different domains of knowledge. So having an overlapping knowledge, expertise with someone so that you can reach a shared understanding, that actually takes some work, that takes some investment. So this relationship of one person relying on another, where they have a shared understanding of the task or of the responsibility or of the intention, and that they're being, one is relying on the other to do it. And then there's a second kind of relationship, which is dependency, which is to say, perhaps there are two different intentions or tasks that I'm thinking about in this collaboration, and in my subjective judgment, one of them, which might be at a higher systemic level, it might be a broader responsibility, I think that that depends on the fulfillment of some other task or responsibility. And that judgment of dependency is, again, it's requiring me to span different layers of the systemic hierarchy. I'm having to both understand, you know, the extent or the scope of a higher level decision to be made or a responsibility to be fulfilled, and I'm having to understand the more fine-grained detail at a lower systemic level. And having kind of invested that effort to understand, have that cross-level understanding, I'm able to make the judgment that actually this high-level task is, you know, broken down into these smaller contributing tasks, and that therefore the high-level task depends on the low-level task. And so with these two kinds of relationship, reliance and dependency, you can see that you will get a graph structure emerging, where, you know, I rely on, so, and we can express it in a very conventional way. So 20th century corporation, I as the manager rely on you, my direct report, to fulfill a certain responsibility. In turn, there's some higher level responsibility that my manager is relying on me to perform, and I'm making the judgment that, you know, that high level task depends on this lower level task that I'm relying on you to fulfill, and that, you know, working top down in the organization, we get our intentional hierarchy coming from our organizational hierarchy in a top down fashion. But my sort of conclusion here, or my invitation for you to think, to sort of explore this further, is to say that there's no necessary association of the intentional graph with the organizational graph. There's no reason why those two relationships of reliance and dependency need to be created and maintained top down. They are equally supportable bottom up. So there is no reason why you can't have a very open collaboration where those two kinds of relationships are being established, of somebody relying on someone else based on an intersubjective shared understanding of something to be done, and also dependency, a subjective judgment that one thing can be broken down into or depends on another task or responsibility, and that we can in fact imagine entirely emergent organizational structures, entirely emergent organizational hierarchies based on these same principles of an intentional hierarchy. So, you know, far from the firm being necessarily this top-down, you know, feudalistic structure, I think actually the firm gives us a richer framework for dealing with more complex problems than the market can. But, you know, for these, because of cognitive limitations, because of these systems theoretic constraints. But that moving more, or, you know, considering more a firm-like, organization-like governance structure, or, you know, regulatory structure, does not force us down the path of feudalistic top-down command and control. That in fact, emergent hierarchy is equally compatible with a firm-like structure. I'll stop talking. I've spoken for too long, but I hope that was provocative and might generate some questions.
It was indeed. I see one hand raised. I'm not sure if that was still from the previous talk, Edward Ndalama.
Yeah, I think that was a previous talk.
Right, but Edward, if you have any questions, or any other person from the audience, please raise them or type them in the chat. I think that was a wonderful talk, Chris. Thank you for providing it. Indeed, it was provocative. I mean, I do want to give a second just to see if the audience has any questions so that I don't take over the stage. No? All right. Well, one thing that popped my mind as soon as you started talking about the cognition and our limitations from having it very granular, or you studied grain and extent, you provided that. To me, that was almost like a comparison to hermeneutical circle, and I believe that we actually spoke about that one time already. So having the knowledge of how a structure is being created in the smallest atomic, like particle sense, and then applying that knowledge to a broader whole, that is actually how we understand the whole. And it goes vice versa. If we actually want to understand the smallest particle, we actually first also need to understand how the whole operates. Is that something that goes hand in hand with that theory that you just mentioned? Not sure if it was a theory, but like a concept from biology.
Yeah, it's interesting because I suppose on the one hand, I'm arguing that we shouldn't necessarily expect both you know, an understanding of the detail, of the smallest detail, and an understanding of the whole in a single node or you know, part or participant of the system. That actually what we should expect is in a complex system is a decomposition of information processing into these different systemic levels. Now, there's no reason why, if you take the kind of emergent hierarchy model that I was suggesting, where you know, where the intentional graph is not coming from the top down, there's no reason why a same individual couldn't both be at one time considering, you know, a decision of very broad scope and therefore necessarily less detail, but also at another time kind of in a different role, as it were, really diving into the detail. And I think one of the advantages of this kind of intentional graph concept is that it can help make sense of the slightly complex relationships where someone, you know, I might hold a broad responsibility and I delegate some of that to you. But then you come back to me because there's some part of my expertise that is required to deal with a very specific question. So I'm relying on you, but then you judge that that responsibility depends on a, you know, a lower level, more detailed question to be answered, and then you're relying on me for that more detailed question. And so I'm, you know, I'm both relying and I'm relied upon at very different levels in the hierarchy, and being able to sort of visualize that or conceptualize that, and to understand how you remain responsible for that important level of information processing, even if you're coming back to me to deal with some element of it. You know, that suggests that there is scope for you know, one mind tackling these different problems, but you know, it's not going to all happen at one time, you know, in a single consideration. There's I think it's failing to acknowledge cognitive limitations, and you know, failing to acknowledge the systemic hierarchy that you get in a complex information processing system, to think that there can be a kind of, you know, single unified understanding of the whole. That's, you know, that's ultimately I suggest that's one reason why organizations exist. You know, I have a different answer to Coase. It's, you know, it's not just the transaction costs. It's that you know, there are problems to solve which are complex, and therefore the information processing will necessarily decompose into a systemic hierarchy.
Thank you so much for bringing the complexity theory into space of the law and the firm. I do have one more final question, but then we will probably have to leave this space, and that is there any visual representation? I mean, I hear you talking about the graph and how we have to visualize everything, because one thing is to talk about, but then another thing is to really compose a visualization of it, or, you know, to feel it really, the things that we are constantly talking about. But yeah, I mean, are you creating the visualizations, and can we access that somehow as well, or?
Well, I mean, yes. I mean, I'm very passionate about the subject, but it does just so happen I'm also building a business on it. So yes, I mean, I have an app for that. The Legra app is precisely for the purpose of capturing and visualizing the intentional graph.
And that app is going to be publicly accessible? Or?
Yeah. We're doing private pilots at the moment, but you can sign up to the waitlist, and indeed, if you think you might make a good pilot case study, get in touch, because I'm looking for some more.
We do have a future law collaborative, and we have a lot of legal domains that we would love to kind of present visually. And yeah, there is a lot of these interdependencies and people relying on each other, or agencies relying on each other. And it's interesting because the more we talk with people, the more we hear about horizontal and vertical and horizontal cooperation. And some people are using longitude and latitude instead of that. And then some people are going with diagonal interpretations and are talking about the transversal cooperation. So I'm definitely very much open to have more talks about that. And we might be inviting you for more calls, not just for a 30-minute talk.
I'd be delighted. And I think you're right to start thinking about the terminology there and the visualization, because from the conventional, top-down model, people think of org charts as trees. But of course, an emergent systemic hierarchy isn't going to be a tree necessarily. It's going to be some messy semi-lattice. And so it's not going to be so easy just to say horizontal or vertical. It's going to be all over the place.
I'm going to be borrowing that expression. Thank you so much, Chris. We will be finishing here, and I'm going to be giving the word to Karim back, I think. But thank you so much for joining us. Thank you also for the links. People do take a look at the chat. Legra.com is the website where you can apply for the waiting list, and please keep an eye on that, because this sounds amazing, and it does sound as if we're going to be having a pilot project coming up soon.
Great. Thank you so much. It was a real pleasure.